This time-restricted feeding gives you this opportunity to be in a low insulin state, work through your glucose, and then flip into fat burning. And that metabolically flexible state of fat burning when you don't have glucose around, glucose burning when there's readily accessible glucose, that is the healthy state that we want to be in. What you're doing when you're time-restricted feeding is it's not about restricting calories. It's just about restricting the amount of time in the 24-hour period that you're eating those calories. And what that's doing is that you're giving yourself all these additional hours in that 24-hour period where you're not spiking glucose and you're not spiking insulin. And what that can do for you is it can improve your insulin sensitivity because you're not continuously stimulating the cells with that insulin signal. And therefore, it can help you with that metabolic flexibility because when your insulin is low for that greater period of time in that 24-hour window, you're going to work through your glucose stores, the glucose in the circulation, the glucose in the liver. And then you're going to be like, okay, I'm out of this readily accessible glucose. I need to flip and switch into fat burning in order to get energy because I'm not eating. I don't have exogenous energy coming in. And you can do that because your insulin is low. We know that insulin is a block on fat burning. When insulin's high, you're going to use glucose for energy. You're not going to use fat for energy. So this time-restricted feeding gives you this opportunity to be in a low insulin state, work through your glucose, and then flip into fat burning. And that metabolically flexible state of fat burning when you don't have glucose around, glucose burning when there's readily accessible glucose, that is the healthy state that we want to be in. And there was a great study that was done where they basically took two groups of people and they gave them the exact same number of calories in the 24-hour period, but one group ate between 8 a.m. and 2 p.m., so a 6-hour feeding window, and one group ate between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m., a 12-hour feeding window. So that first group was time-restricted feeding. And even though they were eating the exact same number of calories between the two groups, the group that ate in the restricted portion had better overall 24-hour glucose levels, insulin levels, and just overall better metabolic parameters. So yeah, the more we can narrow that window, we give our body this opportunity to essentially tap into metabolic flexibility. If we're just eating essentially from breakfast right when we wake up and like dessert an hour before we go to bed, that's just basically keeping glucose and insulin sort of stimulated all the time, and is unfortunately you're losing that opportunity to be in a low insulin state and all the potential benefits that can come from that.
Yeah, and again, evolutionary history, it's not how we ate before.
Right.
It's sort of a modern luxury that we can eat that way and constantly be spiking our blood sugar. We were never really, not designed, because I'm not saying that somebody designed us any particular way, but it wasn't part of our of how our genes evolved. We didn't have all these carbohydrates available to us. So let's pivot a little bit into the topic of a level 10 score. 10 is the idea that, when you eat, just like when you work out, you will see some bump, right? Everybody knows that. It's not that you're not trying to have any bump. Well, actually, not everybody knows that. That's why we're explaining it here. So it's natural to have your glucose go up when you eat a little bit. Now, for context, give us a little bit of the ranges, because people know about getting their fasting glucose test from the doctors. Walk us through that, and let's talk about what levels looks at as the optimal ranges. Like, where do we want our blood sugar to be when it comes to the optimal range when we're wearing like a continuous glucose monitor?
Yeah, so talking sort of first about what the standard ranges are. So these are what the governing bodies are telling us are normal. And so when you look at fasting glucose, below 100, so 100 or below of a fasting glucose, meaning your glucose when you wake up and you have not had any calories for 8 hours, if that's under 100, you're considered normal, non-diabetic, not pre-diabetic. Between 100 and 125, it's pre-diabetic fasting glucose range. And if you are 126 or above, you're considered to have type 2 diabetes. So what that means is that if you have a fasting glucose of 99 when you walk into the doctor's office, it's very likely the doctor's going to say, you're normal. You have a normal fasting glucose. I think a lot of people are realizing that might not be the way we should be looking at this, because is 99 really optimal if you're 1 point away from being pre-diabetic? Does that mean that you're totally in the clear? The answer is no. And the research suggests that as you move higher in the normal range towards a pre-diabetic fasting glucose level, your risk for a whole host of diseases, from stroke to heart disease to, of course, developing type 2 diabetes or obesity, all go up very significantly. So if we really dig into the research, it's probably more likely that having a fasting glucose between about 70 and 85 is going to lead to much better health outcomes than if your fasting glucose is 99, even though both are within this bucket category of normal. And so I think there's a real opportunity in the research community to start setting some guidelines around what are optimal ranges as opposed to just normal ranges. Because these ranges that were created, normal, pre-diabetic, diabetic, this is for risk stratification. This is for helping doctors understand, when to prescribe medications, resource allocation, but it's not actually telling us what we should be shooting for optimal health. The same is true for post-meal glucose values. So we think about fasting glucose, which is when you haven't eaten anything for 8 hours, but then we also think about what are the ranges for after you eat something, where do you want to be? So right now, if you look at the International Diabetes Federation, they would say that you want to stay generally under 140 milligrams per deciliter after a meal. So let's say your glucose is 80 before lunch and then goes up and stays under 140 and then comes back down. That's considered to be fine. Again, I would argue that that's probably higher than we want to go after every meal. If you look at actually the literature, they've done quite a few studies where they've put continuous glucose monitors on healthy non-diabetic populations, and the vast majority of time, like well over 90% of the day, people are actually spending their time between a range of 70 and 120. So that's probably closer to where we want to be even after meals, is like under 120. I tend to shoot for like under 110 or 100 or so after meals. So really only getting up at most like 30 points elevated after eating something. So let's say I start at 80, I don't really want to go above 110. If I start at 90, I don't really want to go above 120. So shooting for these narrower ranges, I think, is going to, ultimately lead us to feel better during the day. If I go from 80 to 140 and back down, that's to me going to feel like a pretty big crash. And it's all part of like the detective work to figure out how different foods respond to you. Like, just being super transparent, I'm reaching here for my phone. I want to tell you kind of about my score yesterday, which was all over the place. And this was kind of, I started off the morning already because I ate a really late meal the night before. We went out with friends. My business partner was in town. We ate with him. So at 5:30, there was a gap in my data, between the night before. So I have my earliest reading for yesterday was 5:42 a.m. and I was already at 93, right? I slept a little bit less, and I had a late meal, which I know impacts things. So that's not usually where I'm at that time. I'm usually a lot lower. So it's just good to see, right? Around, I woke up around like 6 a.m. and there's a increase in glucose when you're waking up in the morning. And then I kind of stabilized a little bit and I got back down to about 90, right? But still not in my optimal direction. Then right before you recorded your podcast with my business partner, I went and grabbed something to eat, right? I jumped all the way up to about 135, and then I immediately slammed down all the way to basically 70, right? So that's that roller coaster that we're talking about, because I hadn't eaten anything in the morning besides coffee. And then I ate something that spiked me up really high that I hadn't had in a really long time. It was like I think it was like an avocado toast, but I didn't get the gluten-free. I went for the regular one. It was at Bluestone Lane, which is right underneath. And I had a few minutes before I had to jump into the next thing. And I was also curious to see, what would happen. So I spiked up and I went right back down. Then this is the surprising part. I ate something. I went to one of our favorite places here in LA, Air One, which we talk about. And I had something from the hot bar. And I'm still trying to figure out, I don't know what spiked me up, but I basically went right back up to like about 130, right? And sometimes what happens is when people are wearing a monitor, you're not exactly, you're logging it, but maybe kind of retroactively, you're logging it a little later on. So part of my goal today is to sort of backtrack and be a detective to see a little bit about what was that food that put me on that up and down roller coaster. Now, look, one day, as you've mentioned earlier,
one day a little bit here and there, things get off and then you can reset. It's not a big deal. But if this is what your day looks like day in and day out, that's when we really start to have, problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you also bring up a really great point, which is that like you woke up yesterday morning, you had a late meal the night before, you woke up early, like, and your glucose was maybe a little bit higher than normal. These fasting glucose levels bounce around a huge amount day to day. And based on the current way we track these things, which is you go to the doctor one time per year and you get a fasting glucose check, you'd think that like, oh, well, that probably means that these things are very static, like that I'm 85 and milligrams per deciliter. That's my fasting glucose. That's who I am, but that's not the way it is at all. It bounces around all the time. I could have, the perfect wellness day, like I'm cooking all my food at home, really low glycemic, 10 zone scores for all my meals. I do a high intensity interval training workout. I get 8.5 hours of sleep. I meditated. I took magnesium, And the next day, my fasting glucose is like 72. Then the next day, I could get 4 hours of sleep, have a very high carb late meal, not work out and be stressed. And my fasting glucose could be 95. Like it could be that big of a difference. And to me, that is really empowering because it's like, okay, if I dial in just like a few of these things and make sure I'm kind of like checking off the boxes of my different wellness practices that I know impact my metabolism, I can really move the needle here. It's also when I see that higher number, I'm like, it's okay. This is just a reminder to me that like things are kind of off course. Like I'm not in my homeostasis right now. If I let that happen for weeks and months and years where I'm doing all those behaviors that lead me to have that higher fasting glucose number, no question, that's going to continue going up. And that's going to be more of a longer term problem. But
it reminds me of, if I could just add,
yeah,
it kind of reminds me like sometimes I'll have this conversation. It's like people are like, I don't want to know all the different numbers. I'm like, okay, how about we try this? When it comes to your bank account, how about I tell you once a year how much money is in your bank account and then try to make financial decisions based on that, right?
Yeah.
You would not know if you were hitting your budget. You wouldn't know if you're overspending, if you're underspending. But at the same time too, if you splurge a little bit one week or you have a fancy meal with your partner a night out and you spend a little bit more money than you wanted to spend, hopefully, knock on wood, if you're in a decent position, it's just one night that you spend a little bit more. Yeah. And then you can adjust appropriately, you adjust the budget. And that's how I see this. I don't want to wait once a year to know how much money I have in my bank account and to see how well I'm doing financially to make sure that I'm saving for retirement and all the other goals that are there. And I also don't obsess on a daily basis of, oh my gosh, I spent so much money today, I'm just going to abandon the whole plan and just fuck it, right? You want to pay attention through the process and see the trends and the averages and see, are you headed in the right direction? Do you have enough money saved for retirement? Can you buy this house that you want to buy? Can you help your parents pay off their mortgage? Can you give X amount to charity that you need to give? And the same thing happens when it comes to, our glucose meters that we have, is we're just looking at these average ones to know. And if we are completely off course with certain things like our breakfast and other stuff, we can start making changes that are there.
Totally. And I think that it does actually, I think, also just build some self-compassion and some self-awareness. Like I've had people ask me, friends who are like, why do you wear a sleep tracker? Why don't you just wake up in the morning and just see if you're tired or not? And it's like, well, I think the body, it's amazing. It has a huge ability to compensate and sometimes like make us feel like we're doing okay until we're not. I know that like I'm wearing a Whoop right now, and if I get 6 hours of sleep on one night, I might not feel tired the next day. I might be like compensating. I might have caffeine that day or whatever and feel kind of okay. But if that happens every night for 3 weeks, there's almost no question in my mind that I will start to be a little bit more irritable. I will maybe start to feel a little bit down. I will be a little bit anxious. I will not want to work out as much. But for those days leading up to that sort of slow, insidious decline towards FLC, feeling like crap, I might not realize it. But the data actually is showing me to stay on top of it before it's an issue. Now, having worn a sleep tracker for years at this point, I have a better body awareness of like what my body subtly feels like when I haven't gotten a good night's sleep. Like maybe I'm just a little bit more emotional, or I'm just like a little bit more quick to snap at someone or something like that. I might not have necessarily seen those early warning signs if I didn't connect that objective data with the subjective feelings and the choices. And so I do think and then when those things happen, I'm like, oh, this is not me. I am not a person who's in a I'm not just someone who's negative. It's like, I have this compassion for myself of like, oh, of course I'm a little bit more emotional today. I got 6 hours of sleep last night, and I know that I can connect those things now. And I think the same is true for glucose as well. Yes, you might feel that crash and those roller coasters, and you might be able to really feel it day to day. But there's also members we have who say, yeah, I go up and I go down and I don't even really notice something. I don't notice the crash. I don't feel it. And for them, it's like, yeah, I'm so glad I have some awareness into this, like, so that I can make a change or intervene before, 10 years pass. And then I'm really starting to feel like crap or whatever, because things have kind of gone off the rails. So, but at this point, having the objective data with glucose, I do feel like I have a better body awareness of tapping into those internal signals of when my glucose is going all over the place that I might not have realized before. And there's a term for this in medicine, which is, somatic awareness is one term. Interoception is kind of the official medical term. And I love this term. It's basically like, how clued into the internal signals of your body are you? Sensitivity. Yeah. And you can have...
And that word is interoception?
Interoception. Interoception. And you can have gut interoception. You can have... And people, check it out on PubMed. It's fascinating. There's thousands of papers on this. Heartbeat interoception is a thing. How much can you just sit silently with yourself and feel your heartbeat and accurate? Some people can't do that. They can't feel their heartbeat. Others can. And the people who can have better cardiovascular outcomes. And that's not surprising to me, because when you can feel the cues of your body, you can make better decisions. You can understand yourself better. So you can imagine, like, if your heartbeat's starting to speed up, like, and you know that, and you're feeling anxious, you can link all those things and have this compassion of like, something's happening and I need to like maybe do my breathing or whatever. But I think glucose interoception is something I'm thinking a lot about, because it's like, if you can start, maybe even without looking at your monitor, have a sense of where you're at. Am I high right now? Am I low right now? And sort of start to balance that out. I think it's a really positive feedback loop. But basically just getting into sort of circling back to what you were saying about your sleep and, kind of cluing into all these different things that led to maybe a fasting glucose being higher in the morning. When you can start to sort of like draw those links, you can start to move the levers for the next day and not get into a situation where months and years go by where you're just kind of letting it happen and you end up in a bad situation.
Yeah, because I think for the most part, weight was the primary thing that people would look at to decide if you were healthy or not, right? Yeah. So if there was a lot of excess weight, then you would say that, okay, somebody might not be healthy, at least in the traditional lens of, medicine. And even in society, they would look at somebody, they would say, okay, just because this person is on the slimmer side or trimmer side, oh, they must be healthy, because we're judging everything based on weight. And I think that glucose monitors are showing people is that yes, while, obesity is linked with a lot of particular chronic diseases, even people who are trim or slimmer side, I've always been pretty, skinny, growing up and not having a lot of extra weight. You could still end up being skinny fat or have other issues that are there, or just not feel your best, not perform your best, and not have the mental focus that you want to have, not have the energy that you want to have to show up, still getting sick on a regular basis, right, which is a big sign of, fluctuating, glucose and affecting the immune system. While I have you here for a few more minutes, this has been great, by the way. Thank you so much. I'm glad we made this happen. I want to just from your perspective, you do a primarily plant-based diet. I eat a lot of plants, but I don't know if I am by calories, not that I care so much about calories. I don't know if I probably eat a little bit more, meats and fishes and other things, but I still eat a lot of plants that are there. Take us from your perspective, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and or just three meals, but definitely I want to hit on breakfast because that seems to be one that's very challenging. And an example of like what a level 10 score, right? Something that doesn't have a crazy response in your glucose and actually like keeps you pretty stable, which is a goal of having a lot more of those inside of our diet and our routine. So what would be a level 10 score for you for breakfast in the morning?
Yeah. So for me, I think I've shifted my view of what is a normal breakfast, because I think you do have to step outside the box of like, what does the media or marketing show us what breakfast should be, and move towards like a little bit more of a broader view of that. So, and I love traveling, because you start to see breakfasts from other cultures and you realize, wait, breakfast looks a lot like dinner in a lot of these other cultures. Like when I was in Japan, it's like, it's fish, it's burdock root, it's seaweed, it's like miso soup for breakfast. And of course, that's going to be all great for glucose.
That's my dream. I would love to eat that for breakfast every day.
Exactly. So I've kind of shifted in that. But if we're talking about traditional breakfast foods, some that have scored 10s, so 10 zone scores, meaning essentially no glucose response, definitely the chia puddings. Those are pretty much universally 10s for me. We've got quite a few recipes on our blog at levelshealth.com/blog, but basically that's like a few tablespoons of chia seeds, some unsweetened non-dairy milk, almond butter, some nuts on top, and like a little bit of low glycemic fruit, like some berries or cherries or raspberries or something like that. That for me will be like a no glucose response. There are some grain-free granolas, like keto granolas, that are pretty good. Paleonola is one that I've tried at Whole Foods that caused no glucose response for me. So that on top of like unsweetened cashew yogurt with some chia seeds on top, and maybe like a couple berries, like that'll be a 10 zone score for me. I have tried, eggs a few times, and like basically a couple pasture-raised eggs with avocado and some greens, 0 glucose response.
That's pretty typical of my breakfast.
Yeah.
I'll do a little bit of like, me and my fiance, we make like a little bit of like our own version of a charcuterie plate for breakfast. So we'll have some smoked salmon, wild caught smoked salmon. We'll have some eggs. We'll have some olives, maybe even, or some guacamole that was left over for dinner. And that is like my favorite type of breakfast.
Totally. Like for people who do eat animal products, I would say like probably the ultimate breakfast would be exactly what we were just talking about, like a couple pastured free range eggs, some greens, some avocado or guacamole or something, and then maybe some fish like sardines or smoked salmon or something like that. You're getting the omega-3s, you're getting the greens and the polyphenols. You're getting the healthy fats from the avocado, and you're getting tons of micronutrients. So that meal, I would guess for most people, is going to have 0 glucose, like 5 to 10 point rise on glucose. But for me, a lot of what I do when I'm on the go actually is I just grab like a Daily Harvest, which is a brand, like a direct-to-consumer frozen food company. But what I love about them is that they are mostly grain-free, they are organic, they support regenerative farms, and it's all plant-based. And so I'll just grab a Harvest bowl, which are their like sort of more savory meals, and they're generally based on like cauliflower rice or broccoli rice, or sometimes lentils as well. And then they just create great flavors. Like they have a cauliflower rice pesto bowl, which kind of tastes like pesto pasta, but it's made with cauliflower rice. And so I'll just grab one of those, throw it in the microwave for 5 minutes, and then take that with me, for breakfast. And that's usually like 0. And so I post a lot of these on social media just to show like you can be plant-based and eat these like big, beautiful meals and have very, very minimal glucose response. I also throw beans into everything. Like for me, beans don't spike me. For some people, they actually do. Beans and lentils can be spikers, but for me, and I don't know if it's microbiome or maybe it's because I'm pairing them often with fat and protein, I'll add, tahini, or I'll make a nut butter sauce for my beans. But I love them for the fiber, and fiber tends to really keep my glucose lower. So when I add fiber to a meal, it really, really helps. So that's sort of what I'll do for breakfast is like chia, unsweetened non-dairy yogurts, or really just like a very vegetable forward type of more like savory breakfast.
Let's talk about some meals for later in the day. I mean, you can combine lunch and dinner because you're probably pretty much eating similar things for those. Give us an example of maybe a couple of meals that are in that same category, right? What are you looking to put together?
Yeah. So, I mean, for lunch, one of the things I love, a creative outlet for me, honestly, is thinking about like foods that I love or foods that are common and popular and just how to make them more nutrient dense, cleaner, and lower glucose response. So for lunch, a lot of people want to go for like a sandwich or something like that. Well, how can you really just like up level your sandwich from a nutrient perspective, but also lower glucose? Well, first thing you can do is you can swap out the bread for other things. So you could do like a nut flour based bread, like an almond flour bread, or you could use greens. So like I love using collard greens as a wrap for.
My favorite is Napa cabbage. It's so structured, and you can make like a taco, a sandwich out of it. Like, I know that sounds crazy, people, but this weekend we made Napa cabbage tacos. Me and my brother-in-law, who's a cardiologist, also, rocking his continuous glucose monitor and everything. It was fantastic.
So good. I mean, my favorite food, I used to live in Portland, Oregon, was this millet burger in a collard green wrap from this Whole Foods plant-based restaurant called Pixie Retreat. And I dream about it. I crave it. It's got a cashew mayo, and but it's just you're eating multiple collard greens in this thing, and it's delicious. So I think swapping out, you mentioned Napa cabbage, collard greens, just nice iceberg lettuce. You can cut it into squares and use that as like almost like a burger like bun. And then butter lettuce is fabulous for tacos, like for small tacos. I also love using nori sheets. So actually seaweed, you can buy the large, they're almost like a foot by a foot at Whole Foods, and you can use those as a burrito shell, and they have virtually no carbohydrates, and seaweed has so many good nutrients for you. So again, we have lots of these recommendations on the Levels blog, but there's just so many ways to have that lunch food that you like with this alternative. So a lot of what I do is I'll make like veggie stir fries with beans, with tofu, and then put them in a greens wrap like this, and put some tahini on top. And again, it's just trying to get as many nutrients as possible without the glucose spike, and always trying to source as clean ingredients as I can, organic, low pesticides, and when I can really support regenerative farms.
Intermittent fasting for a lot of people works really well. Now, it's not for everybody. I don't do it trying to get pregnant, breastfeeding. I'm currently breastfeeding, so there's no fasting for me right now. I know that there's a lot of people for whom a history of an eating disorder, a negative relationship with food. There are certain people for whom fasting can be really triggering and it's not appropriate. There are some other health conditions where it cannot be so great, and you want to look into those. And I'll talk about keto in a minute versus pure fasting. But for most people, a 16-hour fast, which is you finish dinner by 8 p.m., you don't eat again until the next day at noon, is totally doable. You're just missing breakfast. And some people like to add to that like a coffee or a tea blended with some fats like medium chain triglycerides, and that can give you even more of an energy and focus and clarity boost. And I think it's a really potentially helpful practice. It's been shown to more prolonged types of fasting, like a week of a ketogenic diet where you would be in ketosis. You're not fasting in the sense that you're not eating, but you're fasting in the sense that 75% of your calories are more from fat, and that puts your body into a state of ketosis where you're burning fat for fuel instead of carbs for fuel, which is most of us are constantly in a state where we're burning carbs for fuel. There's really interesting evidence there that this can clean up dead cells, that this can help your body kill off cancer cells, that it can lower inflammation in the body. And people can also feel really good on it when it comes to clarity, energy, focus. And so an intermittent fast that's 16-hour, appropriate, not for everyone, but for a lot of people to try. And I personally, when I'm not pregnant or breastfeeding, which frankly has like not been that much in the past 2 years, but 2022 is my year. I'm going to be back there, and I will definitely be intermittent fasting a couple days a week. When it comes to a more prolonged fast, I generally like a keto fast because I think that it's manageable, it's doable. I'm eating, I'm not hungry. And you can do keto the right way, or you can do keto maybe like not so much the right way. So you've had various people probably talk about this, but there's some great books out there on how to do keto while not like eating bacon and cream cheese for 5 days or whatever, because that's just like not good for your body. Making sure you're incorporating vegetables, still getting 75% of your calories from fat. And what I'll recommend do myself periodically, for me, it's more like once a year, but I find for some patients, depending what their goals are, maybe up to 4 times a year, doing what I call Keto Sprint. So 5-day keto fast or keto experience is kind of a really nice pause, a really nice reset. And a lot of people experience benefit from that. And the research is really compelling. What I don't recommend there are definitely folks out there, and maybe they're just like more overachievers or goal oriented than I am, but I'm not, there isn't enough research out there for me to feel good about somebody being on a ketogenic diet, like as a lifestyle, long term. I know people do it. I know there's biohackers who do it. As a medical doctor, I'm pretty conservative. And I think that, we really don't know enough about that.
So what we want to be thinking about, the first couple of days for some women, there's like some cramping and some lethargy, and like people kind of feel like a little crampy. But once you sort of like after day 2 or 3 and you're sort of in the flow, pun intended, so to speak, this is a really great time to actually dive into a ketogenic diet if you haven't tried it before, or to engage in fasting, because like I said, the hormone that is responsible for driving up your appetite is not there. So you can afford to do some of these more. And when I say fasting, I should also just say not time restricted eating. So people will call like an intermittent fast. Like I think that you can do that all through your cycle. But when I say fast, I mean like a 24-hour fast or longer. So you can play with those parameters in that first week, or kind of just get your toes wet and kind of see how it feels. So I really like a ketogenic diet in that bleed week. And when the way that we do it in the Estima diet or the Estima method is we do what I call like the classic protocol, which is like a 70% fat, a 20% protein, and then a 10% carbohydrate intake. So that's a really nice way to, you can play around with it for a couple of days if you've never done it before, or if you're a seasoned ketogenic, dieter, then you can kind of just jump right in when you're feeling like that lethargy lifts a little bit from that first day or second day of your period. When we move into the second week, so towards the end of the first week and now full on in week 2, as I mentioned before, week 2 is like our extroverted week. We're sexy, we're flirty, and we're extroverted. This is the week where I mentioned before testosterone peaks. This is the highest point that testosterone is going to make during our cycle. So I really like to profit off of increasing your protein intake to coincide with that testosterone apex, because most people don't realize this, but you can actually build muscle 2 ways. One is mechanically, right? The mechanical stimulus that you'll get going to the gym, resistance training. The other is through your diet. So when you are increasing your protein intake, you are going to drive, assuming that you get a sufficient amount of an amino acid called leucine, you are going to drive something called muscle protein synthesis, which, like the name suggests, it is synthesizing muscle protein. So this is super important for, no matter how old you are, whether you are actually menopausal or not, this is actually really, really, or you are in your reproductive years, building muscle is one of the ways that we can really take when we're taking a slant or we're taking a filter on longevity and health span, the more lean muscle mass that you can accrue, the better off you're going to be in terms of independence, in terms of strength, in terms of pliability, in terms of bone density, in terms of brain health. Like there's so many things. So, doing it both ways, like both the mechanical stimulus in the gym and the chemical stimulus through your diet. So I usually change up the macronutrient composition here. So I will, depending on the person, I'll either do like a 40-40-20. So like 40% fat, 40% protein. And then the fill is carbohydrate, like 20% carb, or I'll do like a 50-30-20. So you'll notice that I've kind of upped the insulin, or I've upped the carbohydrate there as well, because as we up our protein, we also want to up our carbohydrates so that we can get that anabolic effect that both the protein is going to give, as well as pairing that with a carbohydrate. So that's kind of week 2. After we ovulate, we enter now into that luteal phase where the corpus luteum, that artist formerly known as the follicle, is running the show and secreting progesterone as we move into week 3 and into week 4. So I like to return here to a more ketotic or ketogenic macronutrient composition, with the caveat that you are now consuming your resistant starches. So if this is week 3 that you are in your cycle, I mentioned before, like women in like that week, when they're first doing keto, like week 2, week 3, week 4, they're like, I don't know, I have these crazy cravings. I don't know what's going on. I need to have a pizza. having the resistant starches here. So like I always recommend like a tablespoon of like a raw potato starch, or you can do green plantain flour, green banana flour. Those are also good, really easy. Like you can source those either on, online retailers, or your grocer typically has like the raw potato starch in the baking section. Having like a tablespoon of that. I always recommend having it in a smoothie, but I have to tell you, I have my online community of women. We have like 1,100 women in there now. And I was like, you guys don't have it with water. It's like gross to have it. They all like to have it with water. So I don't know, maybe it's just me. I thought I could hide it in a smoothie, but you can also, I guess if you're a gangster, just like put it in some water and shoot it back. So some resistant starches in week 3. And then as we move into week 4, that week before your period, we sort of have half of the week where we have the apex of progesterone, apex of estrogen is there, lots of cravings. And as I mentioned before, we have if you were to do some blood work during that time, glutathione, your B vitamins, your D vitamins, serotonin also drops. You'll also see an uptake of protein utilization, like amino acids are lower in the serum. You'll see lower glucose, lower free fatty acids. And that's because it's like all hands on deck. We got to build this endometrial lining. So this is a time for us to relax a little bit in terms of our calories. I actually want you to increase your calories this week because you need it. You're building an organ, ladies. Like, let's not forget, you build a new organ every single month in the form of your endometrial lining. So it's not like I'm telling you to go get a pint of Ben and Jerry's, but maybe you're increasing it by 10, 15% of your regular caloric consumption. And I also like to relax the macronutrient composition again. So we have a bit of a higher carbohydrate intake, a little bit of a higher protein intake, because that also helps with satiety, help the sense of feeling full. With more, like the more protein you have, the more full you tend to feel. So I'll do again like a 40-20, a 40-40-20, or like a 50-30, like whatever the woman, like you have to play with it a little bit. Like it's not like a cookie cutter, everybody does this, but for the most part, most women do really well in like a 50-30-20, 40-40-20 kind of breakdown. And then they're also increasing their carbohydrates because you need it. Your calories rather, because you need it. You're like I said, you're creating an organ. Whether or not you want to, is another conversation, but increasing that caloric intake is going to help with you keeping on track and not just falling off the wagon and eating everything in sight, which is what I used to do. I used to, think, like I was saying to you in the pre-chat, like strong like bull. Like I used to think I could just power through, put my head down and like punch it out. And then by the end of week 4, I was such a maniac. I was just like raiding the pantry and like just get in my belly. It was like whatever it was, just get in my belly. And that was because I really wasn't honoring my own rhythms. Like I was trying so hard to stick to that ketotic, like so hard to keep those carbohydrates down, trying to keep the calories down. And then I would mess up. And of course, the internal, like the critic inside would be like, see, you're a loser. You can't do it. Da, da, da. But like ladies who are trying to do that, like, let's just cut some emotional cords here. You need more calories and just like release it. Like it's just physiology.
Because as you said, like the contrast to honoring and eating according to your cycle would be trying to stick to something that's the same every day, or stick to something that's the same type of macronutrient breakdown every day, thinking that's going to be the thing that's going to help you get closer. So when you started to do this for yourself, we were chatting a little bit earlier, as you mentioned, you were saying that you would have really terrible periods and bleeding and
the worst.
I'm sure probably also like PMS symptoms along with it.
You got it.
So when you started to shift and eat it more in accordance with your cycle, what were some of the changes that you noticed for yourself?
Well, the first thing that I noticed, my sleep was getting better. So a lot of women will complain about sleep disturbances in that luteal phase. But what I was finding was, as I was eating and as I was changing the way that I was eating, my sleep was getting better, which was, for any woman, any mother, this is like, sleep is just like the holy, it's the thing that you want the most in life is this wonderful restful sleep. So that was the first thing. And then the other thing, like you mentioned, I had, my partner Giovanni would be like, okay, like slowly backing out of the room because he would just walk into the room wrong and I would be in tears and it would just be like this mess. So my mood was much more stable. So I was much, and in depending on the amount of stress that you're under, of course, that can influence things, but the mood state, like the stability, was one of the big things that I noticed for myself. And then I started, when I was playing around with some of these protocols, I would go back to the clinic and I would say, okay, like I want you to try this, and like I want you to take this. We have there's a really nice I'll give you the link for it. It's called the Depression, Anxiety, and Stress score. So it's called the DASS, DASS. And this is a really nice subjective questionnaire that can give us understandings of how a woman, and I would give it to my women like all through their cycle. And of course we would see the DASS, like her scores would get lower in that luteal phase. So I would start giving these women this DASS questionnaire and noticing as we were changing up their macronutrient composition that their DASS scores were actually much more level, much more even keel through the month. So those were like the first two things. And the other thing that I also should say, and I don't know if we'll get to it today, but I also started changing the way that I exercise through the month as well. And I'm happy to talk about it if there's time. But that fourth week, I really do like to reserve it, particularly the second half of that fourth week, for recovery. And as a recovering perfectionist, as a type A personality, I know how hard that is for so many women to be like, there's no way. I'm just going to like put my head down and I'm going to do a soul cycle or whatever it is. And I'm going to, do my HIIT training and whatever. But be forewarned, like buyer beware. If you refuse to recover, which is where all your gains happen, your body will hold on to your fat like an insurance policy and it will not let it go. So making sure that there's time in that week, especially in that second half of that fourth week, for recovery, for active recovery. So walks, Pilates, much more what I call, or not just what I call, but what's called NEAT. So non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So like just, cleaning like your mother-in-law's coming over, like we all know how good we clean when like we have guests coming over, right? Like those kind of lower level activities where you're not sprinting or you don't have these like explosive HIIT sessions, because that is going to drive up your cortisol and it's also going to not allow your body to release some of the fat or excess adiposity that it may have.
So for the women that you were working with that were in your clinic that were following these protocols, like, ketogenic diet or other components, you've mentioned about weight loss, but what do you think it was doing that even though they were trying their best, what was going on in their body that was preventing the weight loss piece from happening that can happen now that they're in accordance? I mean, weight loss has so many layers to it. There's so many
100%.
factors that can contribute to it.
Yeah.
But big picture wise, what would be reasons why you would see that the men who would follow it, maybe, just anecdotally from the experiences that you had with working with patients, let's say you had a couple, the guy would just think it and start to see weight loss that was there. Obviously, he was following the protocol too, but the woman would have some challenges. So what is going on? What mechanisms are happening that would actually support the weight loss function when we're eating in accordance to our cycle?
So I think one of the things that I believe that this method of eating helps to solve is this constant stress response. Because whenever you eat something, it is a short-term investment in how you feel, a medium-term investment in how you look, and then a long-term investment in terms of how you perform. But if you are constantly restricting the carbs, no matter what, like there's a time and a place to do that, right? If you are new to the ketogenic diet, we definitely want to be able to, start turning the cogs in terms of your fat burning ability. So there's that metabolic shift or that metabolic flexibility that we want to allow you to step into. But once you've kind of accrued that skill. For a woman to constantly be restricting her carbohydrates, this is a stress response. And women in general, because of our reproductive function, whether or not you want to have babies, we are much more defensive of our fat stores. So, you and I were talking, I had mentioned to you, I think I may have mentioned this to you at a lunch or something, but I used to be a figure competitor. So figure is kind of like a one step in terms of muscular development, like higher than bikini, and then like a step or two down from bodybuilding. So sort of like, if you look at like Shape magazine or Fitness RX or something, that's sort of the muscularity that they're kind of looking for. And I had driven through my nutrition and my training, my body fat so low that I actually lost my period. So I lost my period leading up to the show. I mean, I did really well. I placed third in like the tri-state area in, New York, which I'm super proud of. But the fallout from that was that I didn't have a period for 3 months. Trying to get my period back online was like a complete gong show. And when we think about what was happening there, well, of course, I didn't have enough fat to actually maintain the regular menstrual cycle. And that is a stress response. That is when we kind of go back to and take an evolutionary or an ancestral lens. If there's famine, right? If there's like a lack of food, the percentage or the probability of a woman being able to carry a pregnancy through to the end is going to be low. So we want to be thinking about, for women, we want to be giving them fat. We want to be making sure that we're not always stressed. Like there's times in the cycle, like that follicular phase, especially in that first week, is a really great time to be more aggressive and like play with your ketogenic protocols. But it's not like that all through the month, because what you're doing is you're sending a signal to your mitochondria, particularly in your ovaries. And, we have like 100,000, there's like 100,000 mitochondria in the ovaries. When we compare that to like the livers, like a hepatocyte has like 2,000 mitochondria. A heart cell has like a myocyte has like 5,000. So you are sending information to your mitochondria that there is famine. So they are going to shut it down, because that is not what you are not designed to have a pregnancy in a low food environment. So women are much more defensive of our fat stores. We have much more swings in our cortisol levels as well. When we think about, we can get into kind of some of the socioeconomic, things around cortisol. But when we look at women, they tend to be the primary caregivers of children, right? Which is very different than the way it was, hundreds of years ago, where we had children raised in a village with sisters and aunts and grandmothers and mothers and everybody together. So we have a woman who's typically isolated, raising her babies by herself. She typically does most of the unpaid work in the home. So she goes to work if she's has a job that she loves. She does that during the day, and then she comes home, and then she's also doing the laundry and the cooking and the scheduling for the soccer runs and all these things. So she's burning, the candle, so to speak, at both ends all the time. So she's typically in a state of chronic low-grade inflammation or stress anyway. And then you layer on top of that, restricting her carbohydrates indefinitely, your body is just going to say, no, thanks. Like that's not how we're designed to work. So it's very important.
It's going to compensate appropriately. That could be low energy. It could be, as you mentioned, storing weight, because it's not sure the next time that it's going to have the ability to fuel itself. It could be a combination of things that could have cascading effects on our overall health. And again, you were talking about losing your period when you were getting ready for this shaping competition and figure competition. And similarly, women will see that when they're training for a marathon, or in the case of some communities that think that they're actually eating the diet that's healthy for them, are doing super low fat vegan. I know that's kind of how I got my start into the world of health and wellness, is that I got into the whole raw food movement. Right. And pretty much every girl that I knew at that time that was also doing it, if she had been doing it long enough, a few months, had lost their period. And back then, actually, a funny story is that some have even thought that actually was healthy, that was healthy, that you didn't have a period anymore, you weren't bleeding, you didn't notice it. And that was a story that was kind of going on in the vegan slash raw food world, that, oh, you know, you don't need a period, or you shouldn't be having bleeding every month. It should actually be nothing. And, you know, I mean, there's all sorts of different aspects, but bottom line, your body will always compensate when it's not getting what it needs. And you see that even more so with women who are not getting what they need, or not feeding their body what they need at the time, or being forced into a system that was really maybe developed for a dietary method for a man that was perfected on men, and then having the challenges that come along with it.
Yes. Yes.
So I want to go to when you help and you're orchestrating a plan for patients of yours, and all these women and men that you've helped too, but we're talking specifically about eating and training and kind of operating according to those phases in the cycle. When you work on putting a protocol together for them, how do you help them learn all this and remember when to do what it is that there is to do? Because just even as you're explaining it, I'm sure a lot of people are like, wait, okay, so that sounds like a lot. How am I supposed to do all that stuff?
Yeah. I mean, we always, you know, whenever I'm thinking about goals for a patient, it's, or someone that I'm working with, it's like, okay, what's the first domino? Like, people will come in and be like, I want this and this and this. And that's actually, you know, when we were talking before about evidence-based, that's actually part of evidence-based medicine, right? We have like what we know about from the literature, then we have the clinical experience of the clinician, and then the third part of that Venn diagram, when we're trying to create evidence-based protocols, is actually the goals and dreams of the patient, or the goals and dreams of the person that you're working with. So someone will say, "This is the end result that I want." So I like to divide goals from outcome goals, which is what that is. Like, I want to lose 10 pounds. I want to run a marathon. I want to put on 5 pounds of lean muscle mass. That's an outcome goal. And so I like to delineate between an outcome goal and a behavioral goal. So the behavioral goal feeds always into the outcome, right? So if we want to lose 10 pounds, there's a behavioral goal that has to happen. I need to play around with my macronutrients through my cycle, like Dr. Stephanie said, or I need to work out, or I need to maybe play around with time-restricted eating. So we want to develop behavioral goals that are going to feed into that. So I did a little Instagram story like a couple of weeks ago now, but I every day, like every Tuesday, I know for me is like leg day. That's the day where I go to I have a little home gym, and I will, you know, go and like punish my legs. So I know that that's what's going to happen every Tuesday. But if my outcome goal, if I only had set outcome goals for myself, meaning, okay, I got to do this amount of weight, and I got to do it in this amount of time, and I got to take this amount of, you know, space or rest periods between my sets, then I would, if I wake up on Tuesday and maybe I didn't have a good sleep that night, or maybe the kids were up, or, you know, whatever's happening at work, if I wake up and I'm not able to punch that out, if I only have outcome goals to sit on, then I would have failed. But a behavioral goal is like, go downstairs and do the legs. Like, just do the squats. Maybe you need to play with the weights there. Maybe they're a little lighter today. Maybe you take a little bit more rest in between your sets, you know, but that behavioral goal allows me to then those are the building blocks that create the foundation for the outcome goal that you're looking for. So depending on where somebody is, it's always a matter of looking at the outcome goal and then creating behavioral goals that are going to feed into that. And honestly, sometimes it's sometimes like the most profound thing that I've worked with clients on is drinking more water. And I know that that's like crazy, but you would be shocked to know when so I'll say to, there's a client that I'm working with right now. I'm like, okay, before you eat anything, you have to drink an 8-ounce glass of water and wait 20 minutes. And then if you're still hungry, then eat. And you would be shocked. She is like, you know what? I was confusing hunger and thirst like this whole time. I'm like 35 and like I've been confusing it this whole time because they actually feel like the same thing. So, you know, if you're someone who's listening and you're like, oh my God, I think I do that. Like, we all do it. But meeting the person where they are and then constructing behavioral goals, as I was saying, that lead to the outcome, and that's how you get it. So it's kind of like the old adage, like, how do you eat an elephant? You know, it's like one one bite at a time. You take pieces. So, you'll take the nutrition piece, you take the exercise piece, you take the mindset piece, you take the self-care piece, you take sexual health, brain health, like you take all these things, and we just add like a couple of behavioral goals around them. And then once those are established, then you can layer on them. And then they become more sophisticated and more difficult with time, but they're only as difficult as the it's never like, I'm never setting somebody up to fail, right? Like I want someone to feel like they're winning. So there's like a little I'll always ask someone, like, out of 10, like, how do you feel? Like, tell me your confidence in being able to punch this out this week. And if it's anything less than an 8, then we change the plan.
A lot of us think that juice is healthy. We think it's an efficient way to get, maybe a green juice with celery and apple and spinach is so healthy for you. But we're really designed to eat those foods together with the fiber. So juice is not the panacea that a lot of people think it is. I think that's really essential to know. And one of the things that I was doing back in my 30s was that I would do these juice fasts, and then I would refeed, and I would gain all the weight back. So it just wasn't a helpful thing for me. It set me up for yo-yo dieting and really, in some ways, ruined my metabolic health. So that's number one. Number two, I would say, is villainizing carbs. So I think we've gotten to a place where people hear about low carb diet, they hear about the ketogenic diet, and they think, oh my gosh, I just need to cut carbs out of my life. I don't need carbs. I need protein. I need fat. Maybe they go on a classic ketogenic diet. And I think we have to be really careful about that, because the data looking at folks who follow a classic ketogenic diet, we know that there's some significant changes that can occur to the gut microbes. So to the microbes themselves, plus their DNA, which is known as the microbiome. There can be a decrease in diversity, alpha diversity in particular. There can be a decrease in stool volume. And so we want to figure out, okay, it's not that carbs are the villain. It's actually metabolic inflexibility that's the villain. So that's what we want to address. So maybe we could talk a little bit about metabolic flexibility versus inflexibility. The third thing is, if I have to pick a third, I would say villainizing fat. So I grew up with Dean Ornish. I remember reading his books in high school, and when I went off to college and medical school, I would make, these pasta dishes with tons of vegetables and zero oil. And I remember in anatomy in medical school, so this is 1989, I was so disturbed and freaked out about working with a cadaver that I just couldn't imagine eating meat. So I stopped eating meat. I was continuing with this low-fat plan. And what I found was that my hormones just became a total mess. I remember my breast size went down by about 2 cups because my cholesterol, I remember measuring it right around then after I went on this vegan food plan with very little fat. What happened for me was that my total cholesterol went down to like 120. And cholesterol is the backbone of all the sex hormones that you make. If you look at the sex hormone pathway, it goes from cholesterol to pregnenolone, the mother hormone of all of your sex hormones. Then it goes on to progesterone and cortisol and DHEA and testosterone and estrogen. So fat is not the villain. We went through that low fat phase, which I think did more harm than good, and we're still recovering from it. So healthy fat is really important for you. It's the way that you make a healthy balance of hormones. So those are the 3 that I think are the most important.
Those are 3 great ones. And I think we should absolutely go into metabolic flexibility, because this is really the sophistication of the wellness movement, kind of the culmination. And we'll grow every year and we'll learn more. But this is a term that a lot more people are getting familiar with, because there's been all sorts of diets that have steered us in one direction or another. And kind of like the Buddha used to say, the middle path is there's something to say about the middle path. So talk to us about metabolic flexibility and how it's understanding when we incorporate it into our, not only our body, but our mindset can be a better way to navigate life, and also a little bit more of an enjoyable way to navigate life.
It's definitely more fun than I think the alternative, which is metabolic inflexibility. So the definition of metabolic flexibility is the ability to switch between burning carbs and burning fat, depending on what type of fuel is available. You can think of it like a hybrid car that can switch between electricity and gas, depending on the type of fuel that's available. And what happens is that a lot of folks become less metabolically flexible over time because they're snacking all the time, or they've got too much stress, or maybe they've got some of those genetic variations that are associated with insulin resistance. They become metabolically inflexible, and they often get stuck in burning glucose, burning carbs. So that was my own story. When I first tried the ketogenic diet, I remember going on Atkins before I got married, and my husband lost about 20 pounds in a short amount of time, and I maybe lost 2 pounds. What I realized was that now I know in retrospect, I was carb intolerant, and I was also metabolically inflexible. I then went a few years ago in 2016, I tried the ketogenic diet a couple of times. I had a lot of patients who were coming to me on keto, and I wanted to learn more about it myself. I tried keto a couple of times, and I just couldn't get it to work. And part of what was the problem for me was that I was metabolically inflexible. So for instance, to get into ketosis, it would take me about 10 to 14 days just to start to make ketones because my body was so used to burning carbs. So metabolic flexibility is really the goal. It's not that, I recommend that people go on a ketogenic diet and stay on a ketogenic diet for, long periods of time. What I recommend is using a ketogenic diet as a therapeutic pulse. So typically 4 weeks, which is what I cover in my book, and then to start to bring more carbohydrates in while you're tracking metabolic flexibility. You can track it as your ketones. You can use a breath meter like Lumen. You can use a continuous glucose monitor. You can use a glucose ketone index. There's many different ways to track this. But what we're looking for is that ease with which you can flip the switch between burning glucose and burning fat, depending on the type of fuel that's available.
It's a powerful way to really see that metabolic flexibility as a human being, as an organism, the human species, has been probably a big part of what has allowed us to become the species that we are. Travel all around the world, be able to think of advanced technologies, be able to expand our brain size, because we had that flexibility, especially at times of major changes in the climate that could affect food sources and other aspects. It's also great because diet sometimes can get so tribal, and really between having using these tools, as you mentioned, the continuous glucose monitor, using things like Lumen or other breathometers that are there, you can really dial into what works well for you. On a personal anecdote, if I could add in, a few years ago when I started going to keto, and a big part of keto in the more traditional sense is making sure you get a higher amount of saturated fat inside of your diet, the clean sources of saturated fat that are there. I noticed that my health journey originally started because I had really bad acne. And I noticed that because I've dealt with so many gut issues from being on antibiotics as a child, that the saturated fat would trigger almost like an endotoxemia effect inside. And I started getting a lot of flare up of almost acne-like symptoms. My face would be red all the time. And then on top of that, as I would track my blood results on a pretty regular basis, getting blood work every month, I noticed again for myself personally, and a big part of this is genetics, coming from a South Asian background. Even though I was not worried about cholesterol, I was paying attention to my NMR particle size, and I was noticing that my lipoprotein A was getting quite high up there. And I just saw that my body genetically, for who knows what all the different reasons are, was not as efficient as somebody else's body at utilizing that saturated fat and putting it to work. So just another reminder of how you can try things, see the actual difference that it makes for you, get your blood work done, use things like continuous glucose monitors, and then you can personalize it to what makes sense for you. Your, in cases, sometimes biological sex, which you write a lot about inside of your book, your ethnic background, which plays a role into it, and your personal lifestyle choices and goals that are there. So I think it's the combination of all of that just like you personalized it, we can all take a lesson from that and look at how we can personalize all these things that broad strokes seem to work for a lot of people, but might need to be tweaked to work for us uniquely.
That was such a helpful illustration of how keto can increase inflammation in some people, especially the dose of saturated fat. So I really appreciate how you shared that story with acne. Thank you so much. Your skin looks amazing, by the way, Drew, I must say.
Thank you.
But I think this brings up some really important points, which include, when I put someone on a ketogenic diet, or when people follow the 4-week pulse that's in my book, what we know is that it's pretty significantly changing hormones, signaling pathways. And there's there's genomic drivers. So for instance, part of the genetics that you inherited from your parents determine the way that you respond to saturated fat and the way that it affects the glucose and insulin pathways. So sometimes knowing that information can be very helpful, or you can track some of these biomarkers, such as the NMR lipofraction assessment that you were describing. And we know for a lot of people that LDL goes up. If we just look at, low density lipoprotein, LDL goes up in about 10%, about 1 in 4 people that are on the ketogenic diet. Sometimes it's not clinically significant, but it's something that we want to track and understand, especially if people are staying on it for a longer period of time, such as they do in the Virta study, which enrolled type 2 diabetics and put them on a ketogenic diet. Overall, they had about a 10% increase in LDL. So I think this individualization is so important. You said something else that I really liked, which is the tribalism that occurs around food. And what I really hope that people hear from us in our conversation today is that I'm food agnostic. So I really believe that, even though a lot of my friends are keto, or they're paleo, or they're vegan or vegetarian, I think it's important to understand what works the best for you. So I learned, for instance, in medical school, when I went vegan, low fat, that was not a good fit for me. I needed more fat. I needed more protein for my hormone balance. So being able to understand that feedback loop, I think, is such an essential part of this empowerment conversation we want to be having with our body, our health, our hormones.
What I also love about your journey, Dr. Gottfried, is that you're trained at some of the best institutions out there, and you have this willingness and openness to try, and also not just to try, but to be open to change your mind when something wasn't working out. And you've shared a couple examples of how you tried something and it wasn't working out. So you tried something different. I think that's so important, especially for, I would say, the intellectual types that are listening here, that you might have a very advanced degree. Maybe it's not in medicine. Maybe it's in engineering. Maybe it's a lawyer. Maybe you think of yourself as just a very smart person. And there is nothing smarter than trial and error and then pivoting after that. You will never, even if you read every single book that's out there in the world, you will never be as smart as trial and error when it comes to your ability to figure out what works for you. And so I applaud you in openly sharing that, and also having done that in your journey, because our audience, myself, we get to benefit from all this wisdom that you built up over the years.
Well, I think beginner's mind is such an important part of health. Having that openness to change your mind. You raised something else that I just want to emphasize, and that is, I'm a big fan of trial and error. I'm an even bigger fan of trial and success. We design these experiments in the type of work that I do. So a lot of what I do in precision medicine is multi-omic phenotyping. So we take someone like you, Drew, we look at your genomics, especially nutrigenomics. We look at your biomarkers, like your micronutrients, your level of magnesium, CoQ10, glutathione, all those things. We look at your hormones, do a hormone panel. And then once we have that data and we know what your values are and what's most important to you in terms of your health, we can then design these N of 1 experiments. And I was taught at Harvard Medical School that in the hierarchy of evidence, scientific evidence, there is, observational studies, there's expert opinion, anecdotal evidence, which is the lowest. Then there's observational data, like the Nurses' Health Study. Then there's randomized trials where you're usually looking at just one intervention, like metformin to prevent the progression of prediabetes to diabetes. And then above that is the N of 1 experiment. Because instead of looking at populations, we're looking at you, Dhru, and we're designing a study to say, okay, what happens when you change your exercise in this way? What happens when we define your carb threshold? What then happens to your glucose and your metabolic flexibility? So that N of 1 experimentation, I think, is really the key here. And, this idea of open-mindedness, I think we often forget this in medicine. Science requires us to be open-minded. Science requires us to change our mind. If there's evidence that is not supporting what you're doing and the guideline needs to change, we have to pay attention to that. And there are many times over the course of a career as a physician that you have to change your mind. And if you're more closed-minded, oh my gosh, I really fear for the patients of that particular physician. So I think that open-mindedness in many ways is part of the scientific process, and it's the scientific method, and it's essential to anyone who works in healthcare.
I think it's such an important reminder, especially in this day and age where also the tendency now is, because we had one political party that maybe went in the opposite direction when it came to some of the science information. We're seeing a little bit of the consensus science has now kind of gone in the other direction, and consensus science cannot be the answer to every question. We still have to keep an open mind. We have to understand that sometimes the most crazy ideas that come out of the blue are an important part of the conversation, and that's why we need to allow certain debates to take place, and and obviously encourage civility and, true scientific discourse. But anyways, that's for a different podcast and a different conversation. Let's come back to the Gottfried protocol. While we have a little bit of time here towards the end of our interview, what is it? Who is it designed for? And can you walk us through what are the key pillars that are part of it?
The key pillars start first with detoxification. So I want to talk, maybe I'll give an overview and then we'll circle back to why I designed it in this particular sequence. So step 1 is detoxification, opening up your detox pathways. That includes methylation, it includes cruciferous vegetables, it includes paying attention to antioxidants. The second part is the ketogenic diet. So really following a ketogenic diet in a particular way, using net carbs. So I was told when I first started on keto not to use net carbs, but I think we have to, especially for women. And then the third part is to layer in intermittent fasting, but to do it in a particular way that doesn't cause hormone imbalances like disrupted cortisol. So if I take a step back now, what I found, Dhru, was that about 7 or so years ago, I suddenly had all of these patients who came to me who were struggling with the ketogenic diet. So they were early adopters, they were following different thought leaders, they were trying keto, they were doing the macronutrients, they were eating the fat bombs and the bacon, and they just weren't getting the results that they were hoping for. Often they do keto with a colleague from work, like a male colleague, and the male colleague would get all the benefits, and they were struggling. These were mostly women. So I saw this sex difference. I saw that my male patients were doing a lot better on keto. They were becoming metabolically flexible, and the women were really struggling. And I called them my keto refugees because they were so frustrated and they felt like, I'm doing everything right. What is wrong? Why is this not happening? So as I was struggling on my own with the ketogenic diet, I realized one of the first pieces that's so important for women is to make sure that those detox pathways are open. So I see a lot of women who struggle with constipation, who are not pooping every single morning with that feeling of utter relief, like you have evacuated completely and you are ready to start your day. So we need that in place before you can really be successful on a ketogenic diet. You have to be eliminating. That is priority number one when it comes to many of these metabolic hormones, especially the estrogens, because the gut is so involved in estrogen balance, especially estradiol. So detox, getting that dialed in is so essential that I put it first. And also getting the vegetables that you need, the allium vegetables that raise glutathione, the dark green leafies that help you with the B vitamins, that help you with methylation. Really important to have that in place. Then the ketogenic diet itself, again, I said before that I use net carbs because I find that women who restrict total carbs too much often end up having menstrual irregularity. We see that in up to 45% of people on classic keto. They often have thyroid issues because reverse T3 can be raised by restricting carbohydrates excessively. And I also see that they have issues with cortisol, so too much food stress. So if you adapt the ketogenic diet, you focus on net carbs. I have people begin with 20 to 25 net carbs each day. I find that that is so much better in terms of keeping the gut component of the control system for your hormones really working. And then I like to layer in intermittent fasting. And the evidence right now, there's a lot of different people giving conflicting information about intermittent fasting. My review of the literature is that 14 hours is probably the right number in terms of an overnight fast for women. That's not associated with too much cortisol or other hormone disruption. So this comes from UCSD, the work of Barbara Patterson. She's done some work looking at breast cancer risk and a few other hormonal factors. And I think 14 hours is probably the best way to go. And I recommend that people kind of ramp up slowly to intermittent fasting. I like to combine it with the well-formulated ketogenic diet because it's a backdoor to ketosis. So most people can get into ketosis after some period of an overnight fast, typically 14 to 18 hours. So that's basically the protocol. And then when you come off the protocol, it's really important, almost like an elimination diet, to very gradually add those net carbs back in. So 5 grams of net carbs per day is what I recommend, where you're tracking metabolic flexibility. So you're looking at glucose, you're looking at your weight, you're looking at inflammatory fluid. You're also looking, if you want to test a little further, you're looking at glucose ketone index. So that's a quick overview of the 4-week protocol.
That's great. And what are some signs, especially for somebody who comes from this background of, pretty major hormonal imbalances? What are some of the leading indicators that they should notice during the program and especially afterwards that they're headed in the right direction? What should they pay attention to?
Well, the first reaction is satiety, which is a very lovely reaction where you just don't feel as hungry. If I take a step back, if you look at the literature on glucose and insulin, probably the most proven diet is a whole foods diet with no animal protein or fat. So this is very well proven to help with glucose control. My problem is when I eat that way, I actually gain weight. So it doesn't work for me personally. And so I have to find a way to eat clean, but to follow a ketogenic diet. The main issue when I eat a whole foods, plant-based, 100% plant-based diet is that I'm hungry. I'm really hungry. And so I end up eating excessive calories. So for me, the satiety that you get from producing ketones as a result of burning fat really helps me with creating that metabolic flexibility that I'm after. And of course, it's not about me. It's about other people when they follow a low carbohydrate, high fat food plan, moderate protein, they have this feeling of satiety that comes from the ketones that are produced, mostly beta hydroxybutyrate. So that's one example. The feeling of being satisfied, not being hungry. I haven't eaten yet today because my ketones are relatively high. I cycle in and out of ketosis kind of as needed. Another benefit is there should be some weight loss. So especially for people who are overweight or obese, we expect as you start to burn more fat, we expect that you're going to have some fat loss. So technically it's fat loss. I don't want people to lose muscle. I want them to lose fat. And if you have fat to lose, that's one of the benefits that you should see from this type of program. Another one is relationship health. Since we talked about this earlier, I think this is a really key concept. I was filling out a functional medicine matrix, and under relationship and community, which is something we pay a lot of attention to at the Institute for Functional Medicine, I was thinking about how relationships are affected by someone becoming metabolically flexible. So when you're metabolically flexible, your blood sugar is kind of where it should be and not like spiking high after you have, I don't know, an acai bowl and then crashing down low right afterwards. That's the kind of situation where you are just a setup for a fight with the people that you love. And so I think another benefit is that you feel more even, your mood is better, you might find that anxiety is improved, and that the quality of your relationships gets better.
Hey YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
If you believe that life is meaningless, you have no purpose in life, you should probably check out now. Like seriously, why are you here? And if you don't know the answer to that, that's your number one thing to figure out.